right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much. I believe Staffan was told we were supposed to start at 4, so it's not his fault at all. Running just 5 minutes late, but
I thought it was early.
Yeah, you thought it was very early. So, but apologies if there was miscommunication. Well, we're here now, so it's my distinct honor to introduce Staffan Lindberg, professor at the University of Gothenburg, executive director of the V-Dem Democracy Institute, or V-Dem. I believe it is your final year in that role, which is an incredible run. So if anyone has a resume, by all means, slip it to him. You get some big.
Oh, I'm not on the hiring committee.
Oh, that's right. Okay, that makes sense. But Henry, maybe. Anyway, so it's an incredible job founding this and overseeing it until now, and I'm sure they'll find someone to continue the legacy. Needed all the more nowadays. So yes, please join me in welcoming Staffan Lindberg.
Thank you. You want to see this slide? Yeah, okay. And apologies again. At least I thought it was 4. Yes, and this is my last year or half a year left or something as director of the institute. I will then continue and will sort of separate the data collection, the infrastructure and all that from, and I'll continue doing the kind of research that this democracy report is based on at a V-Dem Center for Policy Analysis. So more policy relevant research and focus on that only. And then we separate the data collection also from that kind of, sometimes perceived to be political, or at least have political consequences. Like this, 25 years of autocratization. I hope you enjoyed the pun in the second part. This year's democracy report, based on these 31 million data, right? And I'm going to encourage you to stop me in my tracks wherever you feel like it. Like, oh no, like that one. I don't buy. Why is that, right? Or, you know, whatever questions. So we can have a Q&A at the end, of course, and all that. But like, feel free, right? I encourage you. Georgia, not so fun last year, right? And right now, sort of. Maybe where you guys end up very soon. Come to that towards the end. So I'll base it on that report, but also at least one of the academic publication papers on U-turns, on countries turning around, which I think may also be of special interest for you in this country at this point. Okay, so where are we at? Democracy in the world. Well, it kind of looks like this, right? The map. More red is more autocratic, more blue is more democratic. You may notice Mexico here now after the last few years. By the way, one of the exceptions of these past 25 years of wave of autocratization building up. Because why? Because it's left-wing driven autocratization. Whereas in the vast majority of countries that are autocratized or are autocratizing right now in the world, it's typically, in this particular period, right-wing, extreme right-wing, nationalist, reactionary, and then anti-pluralist. And just a second, that's one of the other markers that reminds me, at least, of the 1930s.
You encouraged us to ask.
Yeah.
So is Venezuela left wing, or is it just before this period, or
No.
right wing under Maduro?
Well, it's not still going on, so that's why, right? I mean, it's red. It was one of the first countries in this wave, right? And left wing. So it's one of the other few exceptions. But there are very few of the left wing in this period. We'll go back further in history, of course, there are tons of autocratizing governments, the one-party states and socialists, Marxists kind of stuff, right? So, but it's just an empirical observation. Okay, how did we end up there? Well, so we know this, right, the last 50 years, so this is the liberal democracy index from 0 to 1, the wave of democratization. 1974, what happened? Portugal. 25th of April. You gotta celebrate that every year. 25th of April, 1974, this coup by junior officers, and then people came out in the streets in hundreds of thousands and took it over and became a social revolution, and we got sort of the rest going with the third wave, end of the Cold War. Like, it's a little bit down here, but it's not too much. With one line back, it's like 1990, mid-90s. It's not that bad. This is country averages, right? Kind of statistic we often use when we look at trends for the world. So it means here, right, in this average, a country like the Seychelles, with 90,000 inhabitants, weigh as much as India, with 1.4 billion. Or the United States, or Turkey, or any other large country. For how much democracy we have in the world, that island out there in the archipelago, does it mean as much for how much democracy we have in the world as India? So you can think of it, okay, democracy is one man, one vote. Well, now women as well. That's great, isn't it? Right? So one person, one vote. So then we can think of democracy in the world. Okay, so per person, what's the level of democracy enjoyed by the sort of average global citizen out there, right? And it looks like this. Boom. And if we draw a line back to an estimate around 1985, the year Henry Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, says something about how far it's gone. We can weigh by other things like territory. It's similarly much more pronounced drop starting earlier than this. Or check this out, by GDP. Boom. That graph tells you something about how much democracy is losing out in the world in terms of financial power. And that, to me, is scary. We also talk a lot about this population weighted also because its relationship to democracy. And we also do this, right? Take the same underlying indicators that go into the Liberal Democracy Index. That gives you that nuanced picture of the world and different countries moving on. Simplify it. Okay, let's make it a bit simple. We have, from the literature, closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, a couple of cases that are, really on the edge, typically moving down or up. Sort of half-assed okay democracies and the liberal democracies. Right? It's sort of Robert Dahl polyarchy okay, but that's it. Right, and remember that this is a very wide box. It's like at the tail end of it, you have sort of Belarus and Russia, kind of. Multi-party elections on paper, right? Media freedom on paper, kind of thing. It's there, but it doesn't exist in reality. Up here, better end, Orban's Hungary. Turkey, somewhere in the middle, kind of. So it's a white box. Then the last 50 years here from 1974, like the third wave of democratization, we had a lot of dictatorships, right? Really harsh dictatorships in the world. That was the most common form of regime in the world. And they almost disappeared. We got a lot more democracies, both liberal and electoral, but also a lot more electoral autocracies, like countries, think like many of the former Soviet republics that democratized, they became electoral autocracies and not more. Then with Putin, of course, things are going bad again. Now in the last sort of period here, here's one aspect of this wave of autocratization. Like we get fewer really good democracies and more electoral democracies. So democracies becoming less democratic. That's one part of the trend. The other part now are more closed autocracies and a lot of these electoral autocracies also becoming worse. Okay, look at this from population perspective, and then we have these 25 years sort of from when the share of the world population living in autocracy started to go up, although it goes down on the graph, becoming more, right? And then here's India, of course, but there's continuation after this trend before. And now we're at about 3 out of 4 people in the world live in non-democracies. It's not looking good. And we've known kind of for a few years that when countries autocratize, freedom of expression typically is undermined first and often worse during a process. It's a wide category again, like you have individual freedom of expression, but you also have media freedom, of course, and then sort of the expression that universities can do, right? Except if you're Columbia or something. So it's a sort of a wide. But other things are affected. Almost everything is affected as well. Let's show that here. So here, now we sort of not the liberal democracy index, but different components of democracy. So you have clean elections, freedom of association. Very simple metric, like count how many countries have become better or worse in the last 10 years. In 2014, like 20 countries have become statistically significantly better in the clean elections. Only 11 getting worse. So if you're above the line, things are getting better in more countries than it's getting worse. Very simple. Now compare, there are sort of a lot of them here. Compare that to the end of 2024. Boom. Clean elections, right? Getting better in 11 countries and worse in 25. It's like 180 degrees. And worst of all out there, freedom of expression. 44 countries in the last 10 years gotten worse. Okay. That was the picture of the world, where we're at, in the perspective of 50 years. Now, what are the countries? Let's look at the countries that are right now in change, are in episodes of regime transformation. Going up or going down. And they haven't sort of stabilized, they're still moving. Here they are. So this is not level of democracy, it's magnitude of change since the episode started. The blue countries, that's to help all men who are colorblind, right? So you can't use green. Blue, Brazil, right? U-turn country. They were autocratizing, turned around, now it's democratizing. Great. Red countries, including Mexico's, India, and so on, are in an episode of autocratization. So for identifying when these episodes of autocratization or democratization start and end, and how far they go, sort of what's the magnitude of change, and if democracy sort of comes into being or it breaks down. We use the ERT methodology, episodes of regime transformation. It's a sort of specially designed methodology for that. It's also available on the website, ready-made data set based on the V-Dem data to study these countries. I can talk more about that if you want. But for now, I just mention that. So there are 45. Yeah.
What's this time span you're considering here? Is it just for the 1 year?
No. So basically it's this. So just the intuition, right? You have a country at a certain level, and you start to see from 1 year to another that, say, it's a small decline. Right? The ERT registers that. But that could be measurement error, could be a little bit wiggling, could be, it's part of the uncertainty. So just because there's a little incremental, we don't count it as an autocratizer or ERT, right? But it marks, okay, here's a potential start. Then it looks in the coming year, if a change aggregate up to at least 10% on the scale, so it's substantial and significant, then, okay, this is an autocratizer or democratizer. But then we have, the ERT has a track record on when the change started in that direction. So it sort of backdates, hey, this actually started back in 2019, and now, 23, we see that it's qualified, it's a real change. We know now it's accumulated to a real change. And then sort of, if it stabilizes or turns around, same apply rule within 5 years if there are no sort of substantial changes, or then okay, we know it's ended, but it ended there, right? So it's a conservative method, like science should be, in the sense that it's cautious and takes uncertainty into account and all that. You can debate the thresholds and all that, that's fine. And we have an ERT application online, also a Shiny application where you can easily vary the thresholds yourself and see what happens. But this is our best sort of guess after trying to validate it. So there are 45 autocratizing right now. The numbers look like this, right? So we have 1974 again, so Portugal and the rest, and Latin America, and end of the Cold War, Soviet Union fell apart, right? The mid-1990s, like Henry, that's where Sharon, that we were happy, right? We were looking forward to the future. Like Sharon and Henry, we were like, wow, no, it's great. Frank Fukuyama wrote this book, The End of History. And meanwhile, sort of already in the midst of that, just like radio waves and, that wave of autocratization starts to build up. Yeah, but at least from somewhere here 25 years ago, it's sort of clearly upward and increasing, rapidly increasing trend of the number of countries autocratizing. This has never been as many countries in the world autocratizing at the same time. There's never been this great share of the world, countries in the world, autocratizing at the same time. There's never been this share of the world population living in these countries. Ever before. It's worse than the 1930s. But this is also, I think, also for you here now in this time period, a worrying statistic. So, some of these 45, they were already electoral autocracies, right? They started to become worse. Okay, 27 at the start of that episode, right, were democracies. The fatality rate is almost 70%.
They were still born.
Huh?
They were still born, you can argue, for Soviet countries. It was quite a debate going on. What actually was the process you described from '94? How much it was indigenous versus influence?
Yeah.
And I think this is the key. If you have something so kind of not rooted in authentic process, this is what you get. And I think this is a...
But I can tell you it's not only that, because, this is, number one, this is the whole world in this period, right? And it's the ones that are still ongoing, so this can go up. We have looked at this since 1900 to the present.
Mm-hmm.
Then this fatality rate is almost 80%. So just the statistical probability that if a country like the United States now gets into, and I think you have, an autocratization period, just the statistical probability that democracy will survive is fairly low. Yeah, the 38% live in autocratizing countries. Here's the top 10 list among the guys that you're about to join. I have to joke about it. I mean, there's no way to deal with what's going on here without joking about it. I mean, I can't. I have to. Sorry if somebody is offended. This top 10 list, including the #1 autocratizer, Hungary, in the last 25 years. In terms of magnitude of change, Orban wins the prize. A lot of them, as you can see, are fairly slow-moving, gradual processes. Now we have Peru joining here quite quickly. I mean, the Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover, of course, after you guys left was quick. But generally, that's this third wave of autocratization in the last 25 years, right? Tend to be slow-moving processes, one step at a time. What I've been trying to follow as much as I can what's happened in these first 7 weeks of the Trump administration. And it's like, you know this, it's like an onslaught. It's like doing all these things that Orban was doing over 10 years and Modi in India and Vucic in Serbia. So it's like in 7 weeks, everything is coming at the same time. That's very rare, very different. Yeah, Sharon.
Excuse me, Staffan, but I can't quite read the names. Is
No.
Slovakia on your list there?
Okay, Slovakia is not here because it's not on the top 10 in terms of magnitude of change. There are 45, right? These are the top 10 worst. So you have Greece. On the top 10 list you don't want to be on. Greece is here, right? You're happy? Peru, Mauritius, Hungary, India, Mexico, Serbia, Comoros, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. And Nicaragua has also been a very long, slow-moving process, although towards the end here, I mean, going from really bad to really even worse. And now, also in this group, right, it's only 3 democracies remaining, so that 70% also goes for them. Here's one thing, we bring this up in the report again. We've done that in previous years, a few years. Written some papers on it, a lot of other people have, of course. But that relationship in these 25 years, especially after 2000, around 2005, that relationship between increasing spread of disinformation, and then becomes misinformation, unintentionally spreading, polarization, increasing polarization, and then autocratization. He's incredibly strong. And we have the sort of macro level picture here, but I'm sure, I mean, you know a lot about it. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the increasing volume of articles around either disinformation or polarization and backsliding, autocratization, whatever you want to call it. And voting for these far-right nationalist anti-pluralists that then undermine democracy. Very simple metric, change of mood, right? Autocratizing countries steering their autocratization, spread of government, spread of disinformation goes up. In democratizing countries go down. It was also really important in Brazil with the turnaround there, countering disinformation around the elections. Political polarization goes up, goes down. Although this relationship is much weaker. There are much fewer countries where this is happening. I'll show that. The next slide. Here's, we can look at it at country level, right? So here is government spread of disinformation. 10 years ago versus end of 2024. If you're above the line, it's gotten worse, more. Red colored countries are autocratizers. Blue are democratizers. Same with political polarization, gotten worse, red countries, and then the blue countries, well, only a couple of countries among the present democratizers. And not that many democratizers, but anyway. We can look at it within countries over time. It looks like this, so it's Hungary, Nicaragua, Serbia as 3 examples. Indicators of disinformation and polarization go up, democracy goes down. And this is not, I mean, these are just 3 examples. This is very, very common pattern in the data. Like this, and then you add all the important work done by other scholars out there on these topics. Like the big picture for me is wannabe dictators, autocrats, they spread disinformation because they know it works. They know it works in 2 ways, at least. I mean, 2 important ways. One important way is first by spreading hundreds of stories, undermine the notion of truth, undermining authorities of truth, of facts, of reality, so that then you can come with any kind of story, any kind of message. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, and you believe it. Like, how could 68% by Pew's last poll before the elections I saw, how could 68% of Republican likely voters believe that the last election was stolen? How? After all the court cases, I mean, well, that's the purpose, right? That's one, and then the other, of course, is to use that disinformation to increase polarization by disinformation about your opponents and about any independent source of truth telling. Why? Because we call it toxic levels, others call it pernicious, whatever, really high levels. Levels when you can start to talk about your political opponents and people who oppose you in general as enemies. Enemies of our way of life. You heard that? Enemies of who we are. And the kicker, enemies of the nation. What do you do with enemies of the nation? Well, Putin knew what to do. He just killed people. But then you can start, if you can get enough of the population to believe this, then you get support and legitimacy for starting to like throw out their universities like Orban has done, or throw some of the opposition politicians in jail like Erdogan used to do and has done, and they are still there, or close down their media, take over their media like Orban has done, intimidate the universities and media to not voice any opposition like Modi has done, and you get support. Because you're saving the nation. And they know it works. So that's why I think it's so, but there's some, there's some good things going on. Remember that. They're becoming fewer, but 19, it's good. Yeah, it's not a big portion of the world in terms of population. And half of this is Brazil and Poland. But the other 17 are important. They have a good track record, right? So, in terms of democratization leading to democracy, actually, this needs some minimum level among these that are currently doing, and they're still ongoing, so it could be more, but the success rate is pretty high in that sense. And it's often a little bit like autocratization in reverse, freedom of expression, this big area. It's really often early, expanding a lot, and for the ones, especially the successful ones, right? But also after that, electoral close dictatorship where rule of law doesn't really matter and no constraints on the executive, getting that back in order seems to be really important in these processes that lead to to successful outcomes. Brazil is such a happy story so far, more or less. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but at least it was a country that was among the top autocratizers until very recently in our measures. Steep decline on the liberal democracy index with Bolsonaro. And then there's several things about the Brazilian story that seems to be the same as in other cases that have turned around. You know, and very different, like Zambia or Poland or Lesotho before Zambia, Ecuador in a period. So one of these things was this, like, and I mean, Donald Tusk has 9 parties in a coalition behind him, from like right to very far left, bridging across the ideological divides, uniting, saying, okay, we want different things in the end, right? But we want democracy. And we need these guys to get out. It's typically a guy, right? If women rule the world, it would be different. And often, Sharon, reminds me of your work on colored revolutions, often building that coalition not only politically, but between the political, those elites of the parties and civil society, really strong mobilization groundwork. And lots of people out on the streets, if need be. And that was also with the colored revolution. I mean, that was the thing. I think, yeah, was it Andreas Schadler who called it magic protest at a point with this? Yeah. Anyway, so that's one thing. But another thing with Brazil that also, and that also sort of reminds very much of these others, that, you know, a lot of then using that coalition in a political coalition and civil society and the mobilization, and focus it on the next election and make that election a critical election for using it to throw the rascals out and force them out. And finally, judiciary. Almost all these cases we looked at where we had U-turns, like the judiciary refused to bend over. Bolsonaro tried all he could with the Supreme Court, and also the Electoral Tribunal, and they just like wouldn't have it. And now, of course, the important with the judiciary in prosecuting the perpetrators of their January 6th and so on, including Bolsonaro. But you know, and in Poland they stood up, so the Peace and Justice were trying to create a separate judiciary, right? When they couldn't force them out, and the EU helped with stopping. So there are many examples of that, and I think also, if you think about it, 2020 here in the US, that the judicial system actually stood up, refused to bend over for the big lie about a stolen election. Looked at the evidence, ruled on the evidence, there was no big fraud. What if they hadn't last time? Or what if these state secretaries, finding those 13,000 votes, had said no? So that's another, whereas in cases, if you think about cases that autocratized and went down and stayed there, then they managed to get the judicial system under their control, do their bidding, not object. So that's a really important lesson, I think, with that. Here are some of the, here are some pictures of these different types of U-turns and the countries, Brazil, Poland, Lesotho, Ecuador, Maldives, Zambia. And there are some down here that are, there are only 10. Right now I'm going, so the bar is very low for to make it on the list. So, you know, Tunisia, Thailand, ooh, a little bit of, like it's statistically significant, okay, but like, yeah, they held an election, but 11% voted, and it was like, okay, now you have a legislature, so it's a little bit less dictatorial. Okay, so they kind of count, but kind of not. But that's the one, and there you see Brazil's continued development. But I think, I mean, for us as academics, right, here is a really a treasure trove potential for studies. Like, I mean, what we have been talking about doing, and I would encourage anyone who feels like doing it, do it. I mean, you could do just comparative case studies, you could do it, or you can go all the way to optimal matching. Like, cases that look like these guys, right? And move down here, but continue. And here they turn around. Like, what was different? Right? So the factors I've talked about here is sort of based on, say, case studies light, and see what seemed to be important, and some tracks, there's some things that sort of occur in many of these cases, but it's not like any rigorous conclusions that I could say, like, yeah, I know this is really important. That would require more rigorous studies, but I think we should do more of those. And historically, of course, these are just the ongoing. There are many, many more of these. We did a descriptive paper now published in Democratization, where we looked at for all U-turns since 1900 to the present, mapped them out. Also did some case descriptions for all of them to validate the thing. And they are much more common than we thought. We had no clue. It's like 102. So, yeah, 205 episodes of autocratization since 1900. 102 of them became U-turns. One move like this. So there are many cases to study, actually. They aren't very short. Now, thinking about where you guys are heading, I think this is important, right? There's 2-3 years autocratization on average. Then on average, maybe a couple of years more, stable or starting to mount resistance, stopping it in its track. And within sort of 5 years from the start, you got to turn around, otherwise it's too late. This is simplifying the evidence, but it's sort of the big story. Like, if you're Turkey and go down there and stay there, it's like, chances are beginning to go down when you sediment authoritarian rule. And then I'm not making a prediction of, oh, it's going to be 50 years old. And I know, I mean, things can happen naturally, but these U-turns happen relatively quickly. But there's hope in that, isn't it? Right? There, you know, you can turn it around. You know? Even this, I think, is. Oh, sorry. Did you want to ask?
No, sure. Just a couple questions. You mentioned Turkey and you mentioned Hungary, and you mentioned Nicaragua and India and so on. And what comes to mind immediately is that in almost all of these cases, the autocratization episode began with the individual who still is in power, right? Whether it's Erdogan or Orban or Ortega or Modi and so on. And so, you know, does that reduce any of the kind of robustness of this? In other words, it's, you know, to what extent has Erdogan managed to cement AKP dominance? And then if he loses next time, are we going to see, for example, this U-turn that you're talking about? So that's, you know, one question. The other very small question, and since you said we could interrupt you, the Tunisia finding on there seems completely wrong, because the Tunisia autocratization clearly began when Kais Saied did away with the parliament and so on. He had a sham election, you know, last year. the opposition were in jail and so on. So how can that still somehow manage to be on the
Yeah.
democratization thing?
Let's go back to this.
Just a small point. But
Yeah,
it
no,
might,
it's
it might have significance.
No, but I mean, here you have exactly what you talked about,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right? Close it down, it's
Yeah.
like, you know, right? And then, yeah, okay, there was no legislature, now there is one. Okay.
With the 6%
I mean, look here, it's like
yeah.
at the bottom rung of everything, it's
Right.
close to the bottom, okay, a little less from the bottom, but it's not much. But it's just simply the difference between not having a legislature and having a legislature that was elected
Right.
in some kind of election. Okay, that's on this measure of liberal democracy. It's slightly less worse than being without it. Okay, so that's why I mean, don't. It's like, and it's only because.
You know, to
I mean,
your rescue, when he first took power, he began ruling by decree.
Yeah.
He was simply an isolated autocrat with no institutionalized base.
Mhm.
He created an electoral system to institutionalize his dictatorship,
Yeah.
and that gives you a couple of notches,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It doesn't change much
Yeah.
else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I've had Russia down, which is also sort of down here in this region, right? Well, if he got rid of the Duma, right? Well, then it would move from here to here, kind of thing. It would become a little worse because there's no legislature. Okay, we know what it is, right? But there's small movements also at the bottom rung, right? So, sorry, I didn't. Your first question. You ended with Tunisia. You started with.
So-
my memory is very good but short.
Leaders.
yeah, yeah,
How much
leaders.
of it is
Exactly.
leader dependent? Yeah.
Yes. No, but I
Versus
think.
institutionalization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday I was discussing this with another group exactly like, okay, if Trump manages now to create some sort of autocracy here and go on and blah, 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 he's fairly old, what if he dies, like what is happening to this, like will there be, yeah, I mean the successor problem for autocracy is typically a big problem. What happens in Russia when Putin disappears? For one, it is a problem, right? To institutionalize it for, and we know that from earlier literature, right? It's, I'm not sure if it's part of the U-turn story because it's those that get sort of thrown out. So I don't see it really here, but it could, of course, destabilize the autocracies when, I mean, typically, unless you're kingdom, North Korea. Okay, but here's another hopeful thing. It's a little bit messy graph, but okay. So here are all the U-turns since 1900. And some started in electoral autocracies, right? Became worse for a while, and then became sort of electoral autocracies again, most of them. But here are the ones that started in democracies. Almost all of them became electoral autocracies at the bottom of the U-turn. Brazil and Poland are part of this exclusive group of 6 since 1900 that had autocratization as democracies and turned it around before democracy broke down. There are only 6, and 2 of them are right now, Poland and Brazil. So even if you become this autocracy, electoral autocracy, not all hope is lost, right? There's still possibility of turning around. Do a Zambia, right? Or do an Ecuador. That kind of would, if not too long, and they sediment that. But then probability is actually pretty high. Yeah, sure.
Staffan, the other part of this is that it's not necessarily a straight sort of nice curve.
No.
There are ups and downs.
Oh, yeah.
Slovakia is, you know, a small country, but a good example of this, that it started out as an autocracy, it became a democracy, it very quickly was hijacked and then it had an electoral revolution, and it had a period of upswing of democracy, and now, under its leader, again, it's moving pretty quickly to emulate Hungary.
Yeah.
So, how do you account for that?
You're absolutely right, and we don't yet.
Okay.
So, I mean, the short story is like, okay, we started with identifying autocratization, democratization. It starts here, ends there, starts here, ends there. No, sometimes it's a U-turn or a bell turn, right? It's one process, you know, and the autocratization, the democratization leads to a process that turns into autocratization. It's one episode, one process with a counter reaction or whatever, if you like. Or the other way around, right? With some sort of mobilization against that autocratization leading to re-democratization. So now we've developed the methodology to be able to systematically, quantitatively, sort of across these time series, identify and separate the sort of standalone processes, like the Seychelles dictatorship, you know, 90s and starting to democratize, and you know, it's the star democratizer in terms of magnitude. But it came out of, it wasn't sort of a reaction to an autocratization, it was just dictatorship and then, or India, like democracy, well, Modi comes in. Right? Standalone, identify that separate from the ones that are continuous processes in two directions. Then we are like, and you should talk to my postdoc Marina, who has been on my case. We have to. Yes, we have to, but we do one other thing at the time. Okay, then there are like waves. And not just a sort of look and wait type of sort of instability or others instability kind, but really sort of several year processes that then leads to. We're not there yet, but we know it's there. We know it should take the next step. So apologies, but we'll get there. You're right. But this part is hopeful, I think. Some kind of hope. You can autocratize, become an electoral autocracy, but not all hope is lost. The US. So these are the slides I don't include when I go over to the State Department on Thursday. So we look at this a little bit. I mean, so much is happening. We had to finish the report at a time. Much has happened since, but I think it's just more in the same direction. But I mean, we had Trump won, and there was autocratization, Biden, a little bit of recoup, but not sort of to the full extent. But you know, and I know that Trump 2 is sort of very different. Many reasons for that. Not the least, they have 4 years to prepare, Project 2025, weed out all the real Republicans, I don't know what to call it, the old-time Republicans from the party and Congress, and intimidate the rest. If you oppose Trump now, you get Musk's troll armies all over you, and threats from Trump, what is it called, not the Trump boys, Proud Boys. And the rest. It's really ugly. And I think, so we go through a few areas. I mean, you have all these attacks on the rule of law, undermining the rule of law. Now even questioning the right of the courts to rule on matters, that what the president does or doesn't do. That's the key argument in many of the. I've seen. I haven't looked at all briefs that the DOJ has submitted in these court cases involving constitutional issues, but I've looked at a number of them, and the argument is almost always. I mean, there are several things, but one of the arguments is almost always that, hey, the courts, you should not even rule on this because you don't have jurisdiction over the president's executive authority. So that's quite fundamental, right? We'll see where it ends up. We don't know what Amy is going to do on the Supreme Court. I think she's like the decider, wasn't that George W.'s expression? Assuming Justice Roberts will be with the liberals and for the Constitution. Yeah.
Yeah, just to clarify, they're not so much saying that the courts have no jurisdiction over the president. It's more that the job of the courts is to determine what the law is. And the president, when following his official duties now, is essentially exempt from having to follow the law.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you are free, if you don't have to follow the law, it doesn't matter what the courts say the law is. They can be right, and you can grant that they're right, but it doesn't apply to you. It's a slightly different distinction. But
yeah. Yes, you're 100% correct.
Worrisome.
If we go down to the nitty-gritty details, I think the essence of the argument was expressed by President Trump. He who saves a nation does not break any laws.
Yeah.
That's sort of their approach.
Fair enough.
And so that's one area, I think. Another area is sort of abolish all types of accountability, right? The disinformation against voters and the general public is just one strategy for not having be accountable. You can, what was it last time, Washington Post? Well, at that time they were at least terrible. Anyway, the 33,000 times lied or misleading over the first 4 years, or the 4 years of this president. I mean, if you could do that and get away with it, like there's no accountability from sort of your voters. But there's so much more. I mean, the inspector generals go down the line. I mean, now making another part of this that we talked about, which sort of overlaps here, but like minimizing, diminishing Congress power. And they're doing absolutely nothing about it, as far as I can see. Go down the line. I mean, there are, and then of course, I think there the things. I mean, these things. Okay, purchasing the military, really worrying. And put this. What's his name? The Lieutenant General, retired reservist, as. Chairman of the Chief of Staff. Huh? Kane. Yeah, Kane. And the rest. And freedom of the media. I mean, I think this sort of goes together a lot, including then now going beyond freedom of the media, other parts of sort of accountabilities or institutions that could speak up and express their freedom of speech, to sort of what we call diagonal accountability from civil society, NGOs, universities, intimidating taxes on endowments, or was it now statutory, or was this making examples, almost like Putin did with like this poor professor from Boston University and students from Columbia and that sort of stuff, right? Silencing us, you guys. Don't dare. We'll come after you. The law firms. All of this, to me, is like classical Bermeo executive aggrandizement. Concentrate power in the executive, undermine the power of any other potential opposing institution or group by intimidation, lawfare, in the courts, and go down the firing people, wrecking people's lives. And USAID, the whole that, and the architecture around with NED and IRID and NDI and so on is just part of that as well. And concentrating power in one person, in one office, that's really the definition of autocracy. So I'm looking forward to the talk in the State Department on Thursday and then be escorted out and deported. But it's like heading here. At least that's my take. I hope I'm wrong. I hoped I was wrong when I said already in 2020 ahead of the election standing, actually in Washington Post, of all places, that the probability of, or I didn't use probability, I said if Trump wins the second term in office, I think it's very high risk that democracy in the US doesn't survive that. Now we're here. Thanks for listening.
Staffan, I have a general question.
Yeah, sure.
Are there any lessons from the small number of democratizers after autocracy that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the turning around, right? I think it was like the coalition of all democratic forces, both at the political level and then coalescing with civil society, really important. In the countries where USAID and IRI and the rest were used to be active, sort of with democracy support community, that also often played a part. But in the Brazil case, wasn't so much that part, but it was the diplomatic side of like immediate preparing and not coalitions, but like coordinating at the diplomatic level. And as soon as the election results were there, like go in and declare, okay, this election was free and fair, and we stand behind Lula in this case, elected Bolsonaro as the lead power and all that. I think that in the Brazil case, as far as I can see, was important. I mean, Brazil has this, history and legacy of the military playing an important, convincing some of the generals to stay in the barracks. And it was only the general heading the Navy, I think, that said to Bolsonaro he was willing to go along with the coup. So I think that diplomatic pressure helped convince, was one of the factors. But then the courts and using these sort of making the elections critical, and that's the point where you focus all the energy and forces. That seems to be things that have worked in these, and then there are sort of a lot of individual stuff going on with each country. Those are some of the things that seem to come out generally in many cases.
Does having a federal structure make a difference? I mean, it seems to me that here in the U.S., several red states are already little autocracies.
Yeah.
But that when it's seizing hold of the federal government itself, there is an awful lot that the states do. And it strikes me that it might not be as easy a process as in a more centralized state, such as Hungary. Any comments you might have on that to give us hope would be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, normally we would think along those lines, right? A federal system would, especially, I mean, there are levels in hell also with federal systems, like some have more devolutional power to the states or regions or whatever it is, and some have less. You have quite a lot, right, in comparative perspective. And that should make it harder, right? It's just that in comparison to 2020, there are more states that are more red. Governors, state legislatures, courts, blah, blah, blah. And they also more Trumpistas, red. Also at the state level, they've weeded out so many of the old Republicans. Old style, you know what I mean. So yes, there are some. I mean, you had this, was it 16? It was 16, right, of the states prosecutor generals that went together in some of the law, in at least one of the lawsuits now for the Trump administration. So there are some of those. But it's many fewer now. It's less of America that's putting up the fight from the state level kind of thing. And it is, as you say, I hear from some of you know I used to teach at the University of Florida. I hear from some of my old colleagues there. They are very afraid and careful. Right? It's like, I mean, if anything about the current administration comes up, they just refuse to discuss it in the classroom. You say, well, you students, you can talk, but I can't speak about this. We actually had a commentator in the Swedish news, the main Swedish newspaper the other day that said that academic freedom in the United States is a memory by now. Maybe a bit radical, but anyway, I mean, and I, you know, in the Dakotas and some colleague there, and you know, yeah, it's worse in some places than others, right? But hey, I mean, thinking about research universities and sort of and leading universities in this town, but also here on the East Coast. I don't know how the university leaderships are reasoning right now after seeing what's happening to Columbia. And with the threats on endowments and on other issues, right? So it's, yeah. But I'm just hoping that universities and US professors dare to speak up, stand up. You'll be targets, just like they've been targets by Orban in Hungary, by Erdogan in Turkey, and so on. I just hope enough institutions and enough people will be ready to do that. Yeah, here and then.
Yeah. Has your study made an attempt to kind of measure, quantify the robustness of civil society across the board and what that impact is? So
not robustness per se, or density, or how much of a strong society there is. Like, we don't have measures of that. We have measures of how much the government seeks to repress civil society or not. And we have some somewhat, what should I say, not too precise measures of the character of civil society, in the sense it's sort of, yeah, it's full of small local organizations, or no, it's dominated by a few like unions and a few churches or something that dominate the whole space, or what's the structure kind of thing. And then we have sort of the environment for civil society in terms of civil liberties to actually work freely. But not what you're asking for. Sorry. I'm thinking of, but I'm forgetting. There are others who. There are a couple of scholars group around called Henrik Knudsen at Oslo University. They have done some independent measures of civil society strength and like density stuff. University of Oslo.
I was wondering your opinion where I spent some time last year in and out of South Sudan, and the indicators that you mentioned. I mean, you look at the abolition of accountability institutions, freedom of expression, disinformation, polarization. Your alarming comment that you made at the beginning, which is correct, about how democracies are losing because of financial power, and place like South Sudan, where you have elite capture, where you have demilitarization problems, you dovetail on what you mentioned about federalism. I have friends who are the Ministry of Federal Affairs in South Sudan, and they're haven't been able to have a federalism conference, even though there's a document that's been in place for 3 years. As you know, the youngest democracy election received the gained independence in 2011. No elections in the last 14 years. They were supposed to have elections last month, 2 months ago, and now they just extended the government for another 2 years. So I was just wondering your thoughts based on all these indicators and the challenges for a country like South Sudan, because you're looking at these countries that your models, countries that already have some sort of foundation.
Yeah.
And South Sudan, you don't have those foundations.
Yeah.
And even what you mentioned about civil society, working with some civil society activists there, trying to get some funding. And you mentioned this, this whole diagonal accountability, where everything that I just mentioned, based on your indicators, are non-existent.
No.
So just your opinion on South Sudan?
Yeah, if I pulled out South Sudan, as far as I remember, it's like down here on their top. And it's been there for a while. I wouldn't, although I used to be sort of an Africanist to study Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't keep up with it as much as I used to do. So I'm no expert, but sort of, South Sudan, born out of Sudan's enormously repressive regime for a long time and civil war, and then internal civil war, de facto. That kind of situation is not very promising, right? We know that. There are some exceptions of countries moving out of that and making it sort of okay after a while. It's not, by far, no means perfect in Liberia, but at least it's a lot better than it used to be, put it that way. But the prospects with just coming out of that violent, repressive history and the conflicts and distrust that creates, plus typically all the corruption and things that come with warfare and civil war, destruction of institutions and destructions of social fabric of society. It's not, yeah. Okay, let's somebody here hasn't spoken, so we'll, yes.
Thank you. I'm thinking now of several Eastern European countries, like Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova, where in 20 years there were these ups and downs, right? Like democracy, autocracy switches, like also very much with the influence of European Union. So the democratization was growing as much as the European Union leverage was stronger. So I was wondering whether you were also measuring the impact of the supranational institution, and also looking at one of your slides where there were the cycles. Is there any statistical probability that this cycle breaks and democracy will remain democracy for a while? Or autocracy will remain at that level? I mean, what is the probability?
Yeah.
That there will be no change?
The three countries you mentioned are sort of that wave, or is there a wave or not, is very, to very different extents, I think. Georgia now is a real bell turn, the inverse of the U-turn, and it's on the top 10 list in the report as well. And it seems, again, like, these days I know about a lot of countries, but just a little about every country. Kind of feels more and more like that. But Georgia, it seems to me, what you mentioned, like the pull of Europe, European Union of Europe, but also as sort of in a big portion of the population really feeling we're part of the West or the Europe, not like, hey. Right? And then you have a portion of the population and an important part of the political elite that are like, no, Russia and Putin is great. And that was the democratization, and now it's the autocratization. That's the other side. And you know, Ukraine kind of similar, at least earlier, and coming out of that. But then, I mean, right now it's just primarily like I have this graph. I mean, it's about Putin, right? To me, it's just an extension of his project that he had in mind already there at the end of the 1990s, made it very clear later, by 2007 already, that the fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest disaster in history and should be sort of resurrected in the Russian Empire type. And he's been acting like that towards all the former Soviet republics, and the invasion of Ukraine is just another one. And Ukraine moving towards becoming really a democracy and moving towards the European Union and NATO, of course, was just like a big no-no. It's part of caught in that struggle. Moldova, similar. I also had, with the elections in Romania, involvement. And they had to cancel and redo the national election. So, I think for the entire former Soviet Union, but also sort of parts of Eastern Europe, I mean, Hungary's Orban's liking of Putin, and it's another part of this. That's for that region, the autocratization story in the last 25 years, that's really about Putin and his enablers and followers and so on. A lot of it. And then you have the local elites that come. But we haven't done the work, we didn't get to the waves yet, so we don't have any statistical probabilities about getting out of it yet. Maybe you could do it. Sharon is leaving in protest.
Yeah, as I explained earlier.
Can you more of this stuff? Yeah. See you. Yeah.
Once you insult Putin, you can.
Oh yeah, exactly. Insult Putin, return and so on. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Very interesting topic today. About Kazakhstan. I'm from Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
Scholar. Yeah. Some scholar called Kazakhstan soft autocratic country. But after Nazarbayev, yeah, how you assess Kazakhstan autocratic country or maybe some democratic elements have Kazakhstan?
Yeah, I mean, again, without knowing terribly much about Kazakhstan. Sort of in broad terms, electoral autocracy towards the worst end or mid to worst half. Yeah, I mean, you have some democratic elements. That's sort of the signum, that's the marker of an electoral autocracy. Like Belarus also have that. Like, they have media freedom in the laws. It's just not being observed very much, right? So yeah, there is, you know, you have some of the same. There are some traits, at least formal ones, that look democratic a little bit, and intended to maybe But in reality, I mean, it's far from being a democracy, as you also note. You could call it soft authoritarian, but we call it electoral autocracy. You hold multi-party elections or in principle, you have some legislature principle, but it's not a democracy. And then there are levels in hell. Like you can be more like Russia and Belarus, or you can be more like India and Hungary in that big box. Yeah.
So you're writing about this past couple decades or so. I wonder how much you thought about the future and whether this could be reversed or whether it might actually accelerate. It seems like there's probably a lot more reason to think it would accelerate. The U.S. right now essentially eradicated all of its pro-democracy activity. USA is gone, NED seems to be gone. You even got rid of the U.S. Institute for Peace in the last couple days for no reason that I could see. But anyway, so that's all gone, and I highly doubt Trump will be very pro-democratic in terms of pressure in other ways. Something about disinformation, probably going to get order of magnitude worse with AI and so on. And so polarization doesn't seem like it's going to be reversing anytime soon. So is there a chance for this to be really a lot like the 1930s with this really significant prolonged decline in democracy, might last for quite a while? Or is there some reason to hope that there'd be a rebound without a world war?
Thanks for accentuating the negativity I'm spreading.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, like the first part of my response to that is like when we analyze the data that we have up to 2024, there's like nothing that points to even a slowing down, right? Or much less. So that wave is cresting, right? No. I mean, at some point, regardless, look, just like with the democratization wave, right? You can't have 71 countries all the time moving up on democracy. There's a ceiling, right? There's a regression to the mean. They democratize, become democracies, everything's fine, they stop democratizing, right? I mean, that you will have a wave regardless. At some point, there must be also that regression to the mean for autocratizing countries. We see nothing of that yet. Okay? So there's no evidence, we can see the data that suggests, hey, well, it's even slowing down. I mean, it's just increasing. So that's what the data says. Everything you mentioned, like in the last, even before Trump got into office, but once he was elected, I also statements during that campaign. It was such an authoritarian campaign. I mean, these court cases against big media companies for saying bad things about him, and I mean, and so many things. Even the campaign, but then he got elected, and then the statements sort of there, and seeing the world starting to react, and he being able to sort of impact so in big ways on the world already before being in office. And thinking about the effects on the world in his first term, when he didn't close down USAID and the IRID and they go down the line. I have really started to worry about like 1930s for real, right? Including many countries involved in a big war. I'm starting to think these prepper guys, maybe it wasn't that wrong, build a big cellar and store lots of food kind of stuff. Maybe it makes sense. No, but it's really scary. Yeah, and I agree with you. I think just take the disinformation and now AI as you point to. I've been saying this for, when when I testified to the January 6th Commission, and to and we talked a lot about the role of disinformation then. And they wanted to know more about, sort of from comparative perspective, how does this compare sort of historically in other countries? Is it unique for US, or it's like, no. But was a coup attempt by any standards. Anyway, and then we talked about the role of disinformation and all that, and went back and forth for a long time. And then I said, okay, Senator, I can boil it down to you in a few words. Democracy dies with the lies. Democracy cannot survive in the long run in a society environment full of lies that we as citizens believe. Like that simplest thing we do in a democracy, the absolutely most simple thing is go to the ballot box. Take that paper, well, you guys have machines, I don't like the machines, I like paper, but paper, and you're like, you like the guys who are in power now and what they did? Sort of, yeah, it's okay, vote for them, right? No, I didn't like, I want something different, okay, vote for that, right? It's very simple. It doesn't have to be more than that. Even that simple act, if you and I go to that ballot box, and we look at what they did and what they didn't do, and it's all a lie, and we believe it, that vote becomes meaningless. You're voting on a lie. There's no accountability anymore. That was the whole point, accountability. It's gone. We don't need to hold elections. That is why disinformation is such a, even if we survive this, even if you guys survive this and become a nice shining democracy again and all that, that problem is still there. It's still there for Sweden. So long term, I've sometimes likened that with, after World War II, in Europe, not so much here, but in Europe, the big issue was like, how do we regulate and sort of create a framework for what's allowed and not allowed within freedom of association? How do we set boundaries for freedom of association so that we have like competition and all that, but we don't have Nazi and fascist parties that come in, use freedom of association to do away with it, and democracy. The parallel now is like, we have unregulated freedom of speech, completely unregulated in the social media sphere, globally. How do we regulate, set boundaries for that in order to save it? We used to do that at the national level, and some countries still do. Right? And until Reagan abolished it, also the main media companies in the US had this truth requirement and objectivity requirements, and things be rational and should disappear, also in that sphere. And now social media, of course, is like nothing. The European Union is trying to do something about it within there with some regulation on social media companies and things like that. But that issue of disinformation needs to be solved somehow. I don't know how. I just know it must be. So more pessimism. Good. Okay, last question. I think the room is out of air as well, and maybe we are. Yeah.
If your pessimistic view of the U.S. is right, and the U.S. is sort of heading toward autocracy, Can Europe remain the bastion of democracy on its own?
I think it can. And one of the silver linings for me as a European is in these last few weeks of the Trump administration, because everything goes so fast and it's so radical, I've seen and I've noticed from the foreign ministries and the European Commission, and also see with the political leaders in Europe, they really sit up. It's like, and especially after J.D. Vance's speech, like, it was shocked, shell-shocked, right? But then like, okay, we need to get together, right? Democracy. And then also reaching out now to South Africa, to Chile, and to other democracies in the global South, or outside of Europe, to put it that way. With a strong, sort of, not only militarily security and all that, but also with regards to democracy. That's part of our security, and that's part of who we are, and we need to defend it. It's a very strong sense of that. I hope it lasts. The other good silver lining for us is that the Trump administration, what's happening here is seen as so absurd and so like unbelievable and radical and tearing apart the state, administration, blah, 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 and democracy, that the far-right parties in Europe now are in trouble, right? Because they used to be like, oh, Trump is great, you know, we love this. And then J.D. Vance came and destroyed everything, right? And their support is actually going down, opinion polls are showing. And then the other political parties are like, okay, maybe we shouldn't collaborate with them. And push them further away and isolate them more and make them weaker. And they are on their back heels much more as a result. So good for us, right? with what's happening here. There's a silver lining there for us, at least right now. So something positive. Yeah. Good. Thank you.